Hey guys, today I'm going to show you some tips and tricks and of course jigs and other uses for a table saw. Let's get started. So if you didn't know, a table saw is, well, a saw on a table. It's sort of like a skill saw. Some people call them hand saws, some people call them skill saws. The proper name is a circular saw, which is a saw attached to a motor which has a base plate, and you run that along the wood to make a cut. A table saw is like a hand saw. Okay? A table saw is like a hand saw except for the blade, except you turn it upside down. So the blade is mounted onto the table. And a table saw is probably the staple of most people's workshop. There's a saying, the table saw is the heart of the workshop, and it is certainly true for me. I use the table saw more than any other tool in my shop, and I'm going to show you how it's used and a bunch of jigs, tips, and tricks. Quick tip, this table saw is my table saw that, well, it's a luxury table saw. This is a saw stop table saw, which if you touch the blade, while it's spinning, a brake will slam up on the blade and pull it below the table. Super cool technology, and it's honestly the reason why I bought it, because I've had 3 table saw injuries, and I'll get into those later. So the first kind of cut, and the most common cut that a table saw is known for, is what's called a rip cut, and I'll show you how to make that. It involves using the fence of the table saw, and this is a pretty luxury fence as well. It's one of the big, mighty ones that's also super expensive, but it's deadly accurate. Alright, so there's a fence. This is what's called a rip fence, and you use it for making rip cuts. It slides along a bar. Well, the professional series kind do. There are some that are like the cheap aluminum kind that clamp on both the front and the back, and I'm going to show you that one. I don't know if you can see it, but this is my old table saw. It is what you call a job site saw, a super tiny little saw, which has a cheap aluminum fence that would clamp on both the front and the back. And this kind is generally not as accurate as the T-style fence, which is what the bigger table saws have. So there will be a measuring tape on the T-style fences, which are like this, which only clamp on the front. This gives you a straighter 90-degree cut. It usually has a measuring tape. Most of the cheap ones do as well, but I wouldn't trust it. I would use a measuring tape. What you want to do is you want to measure from the blade to the fence. On this saw, it has a measuring tape with an indicator, so you can set the measurement to whatever you want, and then lock it down. To lock it down, usually there's just a lever that you simply just pull down. So now that you've got your fence set, I've got the distance that I want. You're going to grab your piece of wood, and as you can see, the blade's height is way too high. You don't want to cut with the blade this high. So what you want to do is you want to take the blade, and it's also just safer to have the blade lower, because that way it reduces what's called kickback. Now to lower the blade, there's usually a crank in the front. There's always a crank in the front that you'd pull, well, that you'd crank, and you could set the height of the blade. And what I want to do is I want to set just so that the little tips, the little carbide pieces of metal, those little teeth are just sticking out just past, just above the workpiece. That's how high you want to set your blade. That crank that I'm talking about, if you turn this crank, it will raise and lower the blade. So the one rule that I always have with the table saw is the distance that the fence is set to the blade. Like if it's under 6 inches, so say this fence is set 6 inches away from the blade. That is good enough for you to use your hand to push it through. If it's any less than that, make sure you use a push stick or a push block. So these are some pretty common styles of push sticks. They're, well, sticks with a little 90-degree catch on them, and I've got 2 because, 2 is safer than 1. You want to make sure you have 2 push sticks if you're cutting. And you just push the wood through, keeping your hand away from the blade if the fence is less than 6 inches away. In this case, if I'm usually cutting, I usually like to use two, one to push up against the fence and one to push forward. That way it results in a little bit cleaner and safer cut, keeping your hands away from the blade. Now there is a better alternative, and that is a push stick like this. This one has a long front on it, and that is because sometimes if you're pushing with the standard push stick, the blade will have a tendency to tip the workpiece up. So you're pushing through and the blade will have a tendency to lift it up and kick it back. With this kind of push stick, you won't have any trouble because it's keeping it down. It's also keeping downward pressure on it so that you can push it through nice and easily. And there are, of course, push pads like this where you could just stick it. It's got this grippy rubber on the bottom. Stick it on your piece and just push it through. Now these usually aren't as safe because they don't keep your hands as far away from the blade as one of these. All right, let's make a cut. Now the one tip that I have when I'm cutting is that I don't want to keep my eye on the blade. Now it might sound silly, but you always want to keep your eye on the fence. Because when you're pushing the wood through, you want to keep your eye on the fence, because if the piece of wood, let me get that out of the way, excuse me. If you're cutting and the piece of wood starts to separate away from the fence, like this, and it starts to bind into the blade, you're gonna have a bad day. So you always want to make sure that this piece, like the piece against the fence, is staying against the fence. You don't want it separating or anything. That's gonna cause for kickback, which nobody wants. The next kind of cut that you can make besides a rip cut is what's called a cross cut. Usually you'd use a miter saw for that, but usually table saws come with these miter fences that you can use, and they go in these slots right here. There are two slots, one on either side of the blade, and this little miter fence will slide in that, and it stays at a perfect 90 degree to the blade. Although, you could adjust it to set an even greater angle, like 45 or 60 degrees. You could adjust that angle right here. So the way to make a cross cut is you simply just want to take your wood, put it up against the fence. Right here, this is a miter fence, not this fence. You never want to use this fence for making cross cuts. And you simply push into the blade and make your cut. Now let's make a cut. Now the one tip that I have is to make sure that your blade comes to a complete stop before taking out the piece. Because if your blade is still spinning and you take out the piece, you're gonna have a bad day. Now a miter gauge works pretty well for making cross cuts, although it's not perfect. Now the best way to make a cross cut, and you can make this yourself, super simple to make, is a cross-cutting sled. This is a sled with a fence on the back. I've got this big thick fence right here, and this is what you put your pieces up against. It's double-sided, so you can make even longer cuts on longer boards. And I put these wood runners on the back that would go into the two slots right here. So you can just simply stick this into the slot, and you've got a cross-cutting sled. So you simply raise your blade to the height of the wood. That's good enough. And then you make your cut. Now you put the wood back here, make your cut. And this is a much safer option if you have repeated cuts and if you just want to keep your hands away from the blade. So I've got the piece of wood that I want to fit in this groove, and I seem to have made the cut pretty good. I've made the first two parts of the cut, now I just gotta clear out the middle. So I've made a rough groove with it, I just gotta take off one more piece. And there we go. I've cut my groove. Let's see if the piece fits. And keep in mind that if the piece doesn't fit, you could always sneak up on your cut later. But it's better to cut off too little than to cut off too much, so I need to cut off just a little bit more. So let's set the fence maybe to right there. Cut off just a little bit more. And there we go. We cut a groove, and this piece of wood fits perfectly inside of that groove. That's how to make what's called a dado. There's another kind of joint called a lap joint, which is the exact same, taking multiple consecutive cuts, but this time on the edge. And there we go. So we made our two cuts, and they simply go together like... Oh, damn it. I made the cut a little bit... I maybe made the cut just a little bit off, but it goes together just like this. Or you could have it together go like this, and there's many possibilities with this kind of joint. So this is one other jig that I made, which is a circle cutting jig. I made a runner to fit inside of the slot, and it houses a piece on the top, which goes in right here. And I made it long so that way you can control it from back here, so that way you don't get your hands in the blade, because I don't want to get my fingers cut off again. So what you want to do is you just want to have it just go like this, and you can cut a circle on here. I'm going to show you how. Alright, so to use a circle jig, what you want to measure is the radius of the circle from the center to from the blade to where you want your radius to be, which in that case is 4 inches, which I've marked. Then you want to drill out the center of your circle. Now this method will cause a hole in the center of your circle, but you shouldn't be cutting circles on the table saw anyway. I'm just showing you a quick trick. So you want to drill that out. Then you want to drive a screw through to hold it into place where you marked your radius. So loosen it a little bit. And there we go. Now we can just push a circle. We can cut a circle through the table saw. So let's cut that. Just like what Jimmy DeResta said when he was making this kind of circle cutting jig, you get 42 door stops and 1 circle. So this is a splitter. It goes on the back of the blade, and it's a piece of metal that prevents the wood from binding or catching on the back of the blade, and it eliminates kickback. If you haven't seen kickback, search it up, and you will be you'll be shocked. And kickback is where the wood flies at you. I'm going to put a link to a video that goes in detail about it. And the splitter is to help minimize that. It won't prevent it, but it will help minimize it as much as possible. Now I'm going to take mine out to show you guys. So if you had a table saw without the splitter, and you were pushing the wood through, and the blade were to come in contact with the back of the blade is spinning this direction, spinning towards you. And if it were to catch, the back of the blade were to catch the piece of wood, it will cause the wood to fly back. It will catch against the back of the blade, and it will kick back at you very violently. Table saw kickback is very violent, and even though there are riving knives or splitters, sometimes they're called riving knives, splitters, spreaders, whatever they're called. Even though they have these things to help prevent the kickback, it won't completely stop it. The kickback is on you, and you have to stop it. There are also blade guards for the table saw, which are these clear pieces of plastic, like that would go over the blade. You can flip it up if you need to, and it's also attached to a special kind of splitter that has some mounting points for the blade guard. Now, the blade guard usually works pretty well. It's meant to be there. If you're an amateur or a beginner, definitely use it. However, for me, I make a lot of thin cuts to the blade, and the blade guard will get in my way too often. And for me, I can't push a push stick through with a thin cut. It's just physically not possible for me to push the thing through with the blade guard in the way. So about 8 months ago, I cut my finger on one of my old table saws when I was trying to test dust collection, which is the rule why you always unplug your table saw before you screw around with it. See, I had the blade about that high, I had the insert plate removed, and I was making dust collection on one of my old table saws, because my old table saw didn't have dust collection. So I was making a shroud, I stuck my hand down in there to see if there was any suction, and instead of turning on the vacuum, because my vacuum was right there at the time where the switch was below the actual switch, I stuck my hand down in there, and instead of turning on the vacuum, I turned on the saw itself, and I cut probably about half the nail off of my middle finger on my right hand, and it was not pleasant at all. Let's zoom over to back in June of 2020. When I had a Delta table saw. It was very similar to this one, just didn't have the flesh sensing. Super awesome table saw, except for the fact that it didn't have this awesome technology. And I was cutting a piece of wood. It bound up because I was trying to plunge cut through the blade, which, if you don't know what plunge cutting is, you put your piece on top of the blade like this, and then you slowly raise the blade up through it to start a cut in the middle. And to do this, you want to have the riving knife removed because it will get in the way when you're trying to plunge the blade up. And I did that, and the piece of wood caught in the blade, and it kicked back, and my hand and my left index finger went into the blade, and by sheer luck, because all 3 times I didn't get my fingers cut off, my fingers are still here, but it just nicked the fingernail, and, well, it cut off, again, half the fingernail, and it was pretty painful and pretty bloody. On the 3rd time, I was cutting dados this way, using the table saw, and I was using a jig to do it, which makes it pretty safe, and I thought I could clamp this piece to the jig and run it through, but that's what you're supposed to do, but I decided to just do it by hand, because if I have a good grip on it, I could run it through. Well, I did not have a good grip. My hand slipped, and sheer luck again, it just nicked the fingernail. And that's when I decided, alright, that's it, I'm getting a Saw Stop. And I do not regret my purchase. This is not sponsored by Saw Stop, and they're not paying me to say this. I bought this with my own money. It was expensive, and I'd say it was worth every penny, because now I don't have to worry about my fingers getting cut with this table saw. I'm going to leave a link in the description to a really cool Saw Stop demo video. I recommend everybody watching it. Everybody to watch it. It's amazing, and I think it really shows how a Saw Stop works. But overall, besides this, the Saw Stop is also just a high quality built machine, and they're not paying me to say this. I am saying this my own opinion. It's high quality, and it's rugged, and it will probably last longer than I will. But always make sure you wear your safety glasses or any safety kind of gear. Make sure you're using push sticks, or preferably a push stick and one of these homemade longer kind with like the stick on, with like the heel on the bottom, so that way you could push through without your hands getting in the way. And always make sure that the blade is off, make sure that whenever you're screwing around with it, it's unplugged, and always take proper sense. If you could, there's not enough safety, like there's no limit to the amount of safety you could get. Like if you feel that something needs to be clamped down in order to make it safer, do it. Don't do what I did and just say, oh, it doesn't need to be clamped down, you can hold it with your hand. That won't work at all. So just try not to be unsafe with a table saw. A table saw is the most dangerous tool in any woodworking shop, and you have to take a lot of like responsibility and safety for it, like with it, because a table saw is 10 times faster than you are, and I've learned that multiple times, because in a fraction of a second I had a table saw injury once, twice, and a third time. So it's not pretty, and luckily I still have all 5 of my fingers, because luckily all of those table saw injuries were just sheer luck, and I don't want to have anything else happen to me with a table saw. Regardless, kickback can still happen, and that's not something a computerized saw could stop. You have to stop it yourself. And in order to do that, make sure that if it's binding against the blade, you stop it immediately. The newer saws have the switch so that you can hit it with your knee to turn it off, so that way you can keep your hands on your workpiece or on your push sticks, which is where they should be. And always make sure you have the proper safety equipment in place. Like I said, I don't really use the guards that often, because I feel that I feel safer with the riving knife or the splitter or whatever the hell it's called, and just I prefer it. I just prefer to have all 5 of my fingers attached. So be safe. All right, that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.